The rise of the global south. A UN report says social spending is helping lift hundreds of millions out of poverty in Latin America and across the developing world. What lessons can countries like the United States learn from the prosperity of the south? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. In the next 7 years, Brazil, China and India's combined economic output will surpass that of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, the UK and the US put together. And by 2030, 80% of the world's middle-class population will be living in developing countries. But the United Nations Human Development Report, which was released in Mexico last week, says that economic growth alone is not enough to improve lives. It says sustained progress needs, quote, pro-poor policies and significant investment in people's capabilities, end quote. It points to countries like Brazil and Mexico, which have implemented social programs that have lifted tens of millions out of poverty. But as many developing countries actively work on reducing poverty and inequity, countries in the Northern Hemisphere are implementing austerity policies, causing millions to suffer. So can the North learn from the global South? Earlier, I spoke to the lead author of the UNDP report, Khalid Malik. I asked him what has helped regions like Latin America progress.
The Latin America story is a Latin America story, but it's also a connected global story. It's not a surprise that China has now become not only the leading trading partner of India, but also Chile and Brazil. And that the terms of trade of commodities has finally improved for many developing countries. This has given a huge amount of policy space and increased resources to many Latin American countries. So that's one side of the picture.
Well, actually, before we move on then, what do you mean by the terms of trade have changed?
Yeah, the terms of trade are basically the prices you get for your commodities, which are many of them are agriculture commodities, and the price you pay for the commodities import. So you're getting better prices for commodities which you used to export. And historically, the last many decades, the terms of trade were declining. For the last decade, maybe 8-9 years, they have been increasing, and I think they're going to stay that way for some time. So you have now a situation where the policy space, the fiscal space for many Latin American countries have gotten better. Plus, many of the policies they were undertaking, particularly on the social sides, is making progress. Also, a Familia program in Brazil, Oportunidades in Mexico. Of course, many people will say that there are a lot of problems with these programs, but fundamentally what they've done is to improve the lives of people and beginning to reduce the inequality within society.
Okay, so
average levels of inequality are high in Latin America, but they're coming down.
So what you're saying is there is this rise in the amount of money being brought into these governments, but they're not simply then transferring it to shareholder value or other concepts. They are actually proactively using this money to lift people out of poverty.
Absolutely. And there's also a larger story here that social policies are at least as important as economic policy in not just lifting people's lives, but maintaining economies in the future. You need both, fundamentally. And I think what has happened is that the growth, say in Brazil, which is 2-3% growth rates, has affected and influenced a much larger number of people. So also large number of societies are just doing better these days.
And what's striking about the report there, it suggests that although nominally we term some governments left-wing or others right-wing, there does seem to be this fundamental agreement in the role of government in lifting people out of poverty and not leaving everything to market forces or into unfettered trade.
Yeah, I think the issue is that if the ruling elite and the bureaucracy are not committed to advancing development, it's very difficult to move societies forward. And I think this is an essential example. You know, we talk about these 40 countries and we really dug deep into 18 of them to understand how their policies were working. And essentially, across the board, you realize that it's not just a question of one government or two governments, But development is a long-term phenomenon to transform the economies of societies. So you need a commitment. And now I'm in Mexico. I was very pleased to see that there was this Pacto Mexico, which brought the current government, but also opposition parties, into a joint commitment on doing reforms in the next many years. So these are the kind of actions which I think transform a society, but also improve an economy.
But in the past, though, this idea of regional policy, global policy, was handled in many ways by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, who are very much based on an ideology which seems to be at odds with what you're suggesting has worked, in the sense that, you know, increased trade, almost a shock opening up of markets, and then not having the government intervene, letting the market forces do their thing. Doesn't that consign that model to history then?
Yeah, I think in terms of markets, as you know, there's been a huge amount of debate and very much at times ideologically driven. We looked at the empirical evidence and we found that the countries who've done better in the benefits they got from globalization are the countries who invested in their people and infrastructure. There's also a study which was done in the report which kind of looked at the issue of declining fertility rates across every country in the world except some countries in Africa, and then tried to understand why has that happened. And we were able to track it down to the reduced health and education expenditures in the 1980s, which were the result of the structure adjustment programs. And 20 years later, you can see an uptick in the fertility rates as a direct consequence of that. These are very powerful implications that these things affect not just the short term, but also the long term.
But does this also have implications for developed economies, given that most of the ideas that you're talking about, which seem to be working, which can be proven to be working, are very much out of fashion in the US. In the US, it's all about austerity, it's about slashing budgets on education and healthcare and letting market forces do their thing. Certainly in Europe, that's the case.
Yeah, well, you know, there's a box in the report where we looked at different studies, and for instance, public investment in the UK as a percent of GDP is down to almost 2%, the lowest it's been in many decades. Yet the political conversation in the UK is about too much government. So there's something is not coming together that easily, it seems. And I think there are more voices which need to be heard in these matters. And I think Keynes was right 75 years ago that it is the boom when you should slow down government expenditures, not austerity. And it's very difficult to cut your way to budget health and growth. If your economies keep declining, you have to find other ways of reviving your economies. And what our worry is that the current readjustments taking place may affect not just the current generation, but also may foreclose choices for the future generation.
And joining us from San Francisco is Branko Milanovic. He's the lead economist at the World Bank's Research Department. From Berkeley, California, we're joined by Silvia Allegretto. She's co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley. And from New York, we have Swanin Wagle. He's one of the authors of the UNDP's 2013 Human Development Report. Swanin, can I begin with you in that case, actually? We haven't really fully explained what an HDI value really means. What exactly is being measured here? What do these numbers mean?
The HDI, the Human Development Index, is a well-rounded measure of development. It tries to capture the quality of life, the livelihoods that people lead, not just through the incomes they earn, but also the kind of lives they have reason to value and choose, and what they're able to do with the capabilities that they have been able to build up. So the notion of human development is actually much broader than what we measure in the HDI. So we reduce this broad, expansive notion of human development as this expansion of choices, freedoms, ideas that were first expounded by Amartya Sen and another Pakistani economist, Mahbub al-Haq. Since it's not possible to reduce all these broader notions of development and freedom into a composite index, we sort of look at three key constituents. So the first one is, of course, income. It's important. It allows you to do many things. It's a means to achieving many things that we value in life. Second is education, which is a proxy for the kind of knowledge people can access and utilize to enrich their own lives. And the third is health, which we measure by life expectancy, sort of the longevity, how productive lives that people can lead. So it's a much broader measure of development achievement, if you like. So the health index, we use life expectancy, as I mentioned. Education is composed of the expected years of schooling and average years of schooling of the average citizen in a particular country, and income is measured by the gross national income per capita. So we put these things together just to get a better sense of development achievement.
So is there a sense it's more meaningful perhaps than simply a GDP number? I mean, it's more focused.
The GDP per capita, exactly. Yes. And if you look at if you look at countries in the Gulf, for example, in the Middle East, they have very high per capita GNI or GDP. However, the education and health achievements are not as high as those incomes would suggest. So those countries, for example, do rather poorly on the Human Development Index. On the other hand, you may have countries like Sri Lanka or even Cuba that do not necessarily have high per capita incomes, but they've invested in the capabilities of people on the through health systems, through public education systems, and their sort of schooling achievements, their longevity achievements are quite decent. So when you put these things together, these countries tend to perform much better in this well-rounded measure of development than what their per capita income alone would have suggested.
Branko Milanovic, the headline of the report is The Rise of the South. I take it this isn't much of a surprise then to the World Bank, but I mean certainly the morals and the lessons from this report seem pretty clear about how regions like Latin America are achieving such progress.
Well, yes, actually, I think it's a very welcome report. We actually, quite a few organizations are, as you can imagine, now working on similar reports. I would say it's a little bit of a very welcome but somewhat ironic reversal of roles, because as you mentioned before, only 10 years or certainly 20 years ago, we had exactly the opposite situation. We had really the IMF and the World Bank being heavily involved, particularly using the Washington Consensus policies in the South, and the South actually being in some form of austerity policies, and the North having reasonably high rate of growth, which was supposed to actually bring poverty down. And it did actually, in, of course, countries like China, obviously in a big way. But now we have a reversal of the positions between the South and the North, where the North seems to be in a mood of learning something from the South, and particularly from the rather unexpected success of Latin America. When I say unexpected, I think actually 10 years ago, very few people would have put their money on Latin America, driving inequality down and actually reducing poverty and empowering quite a lot of people. It didn't seem likely 10 years ago.
But are they in the mood to learn, Silvia Allegretto? I mean, this idea of proactive policies for the poor, pro-poor policies. I mean, these are the sort of policies that, as I suggested, seem to be rather out of fashion in Washington and elsewhere.
Yeah, they've absolutely fallen out of fashion, not even policies to be proactive for the poor. We've not made any real inroads to decreasing poverty since the 1960s here in the U.S. But we don't have the policies to make sure that the growth that we have actually filters down to all levels of the income distribution. Over the last 30 years, we know that the middle incomes, especially low-wage workers, have not benefited from an economy that has doubled since the 1970s, for instance, but their wages have been stagnating. So, in the U.S., I think we've kind of forgotten our history here, especially our history post-World War II, when we had significant and sustained investments in the United States, our infrastructure, our roads, and our research and development, and in our human capital through education. And now, we're making it more and more difficult for people to, for instance, obtain education at higher degrees as it's becoming very expensive. And as I said, that wages and family incomes, especially over the last few years resulting from the Great Recession, have actually declined. So it's very, very difficult for your typical American to kind of make their way through this new economy, where our government now is pursuing even more, after actually layers and layers of austerity, especially at the state and local levels, to now be pursuing austerity at the federal level. And there's just no way we can kind of get out of this, and I think that's why we're seeing sustained slow growth. remain very high unemployment rates. And the growth that we have managed to eke out over the last few years, we've shown that all of that, the additional benefits to that growth, have gone to the top 1%. So our extremely big problem with inequality going into the Great Recession has only gotten worse on the other side.
Well, let's look at a specific program that appears to have been pretty successful across Latin America. And again, we talk about left and right-wing governments often, but I mean those differences seem relatively meaningless when it comes down to the implementation of these proactive pro-poor policies. So these are the conditional cash transfer programs that we want to look at that offer families monetary incentives for keeping children in school and having regular medical checkups. Here are some of the programs that have been successful in Latin America. Mexico's Oportunidades program was one of the first and most successful conditional cash transfer programs. It began in 1997 by paying rural families a stipend for school attendance, clinic visits, and participation in community meetings. After 2 years in the program, more than 18% of participating families are no longer living in extreme poverty. Brazil's Family Grant program pays more than 13 million families to keep their children in school rather than sending them out to work. Bolsa Familia costs less than 1% of Brazil's GDP, but has helped lift more than 22 million people out of extreme poverty over the last decade. And since 2002, Chile's Solidario program has tried to help the country's extreme poor by combining cash transfers to mothers with social worker visits. The program also gives the poorest families access to subsidized housing and education. And what's interesting, though, there's a section in the report written by Michael Bloomberg, actually, the New York City mayor, who says, look, we looked at this and we tried this out. And that program in New York is now called the Family Reward Program. And I just spoke, actually, with the person who's administering the Family Reward Program in New York. And he says the problem with trying to get these sorts of programs off the ground in the US is, one, public funding is very difficult to get unless there's a great deal of private funding already in the bag. But secondly, it's just the whole attitude towards preventative social policy. Here's what he had to say.
We respond to the emergency, but we are often unwilling to respond to the challenge that created the emergency before it gets to that level. So, everybody understands we need emergency rooms, but the question is, do we invest in preventive health care? We'll invest in foster care for those cases where a family isn't able to care for a child, but we won't necessarily invest in keeping the family strong in the first place before you have to get to that point. In too many circumstances, we have what can only be described as a penny-wise, pound-foolish approach. Whether it's in juvenile justice or in education, you'll pay. And you pay when that young person becomes an adult criminal who goes to jail, or you can pay to provide that young person with a quality education so that they never enter the criminal justice system in the first place. You'll pay either way, but too often in this country we're willing to pay at the end for the crisis, but we're not willing to pay in providing the preventive supports that could have averted the crisis in the first place. So it's unfortunate that often you have to use private dollars to invest in challenges like this, but in many cases that's what we have to do.
Branka, I know you've been writing about income inequality and the attempts in the US especially to try and address some of these issues, these worsening issues of income inequality. And yet there seem to be these cognitive barriers almost in dealing with these issues and taking that long view and spending a little bit now to prevent a great deal of expense later. What's going so wrong?
Well, it's true, actually. I think it goes back to these cognitive issues, if you, as you call them, it goes back to the 1980s, where there was a sea change, I think, in the US and the West, and then, of course, sort of carried over to the rest of the world, is that essentially social transfers there are too many of them, they are too costly, they don't do their job, they're wasteful. And there was this ideological change which happened then, and the approach was essentially have growth and have it trickle down to the poor, and they will get jobs and everything will be fine. And as Sylvia said, it is striking. Of course, these issues have not been raised in a big way until the Great Recession happened. But it was striking that in the US, which tripled its income, you had really a constant rate of poverty measured by using a constant in real prices yardstick. So it's really something that you definitely would not expect if the trickle-down economics worked. But as we have seen, it did not work. Now, to start to make a proactive policies and to change that would require a similar sea change, ideological sea change. And this is very difficult to come by because we don't see, or at least I don't see, too many traces of that. And as we just saw, the results of the last 3 years have further exacerbated inequality in the U.S.
But in the past, Branko, you've written that even to broach issues of income inequality in even academic economic circles, perhaps, is to be branded as someone who's just peddling in the politics of envy. Is there something particularly American about this, about meritocracy, and about not necessarily rewarding the poor for taking personal responsibility? Is that part of it too, perhaps?
Well, it may not have been only limited to the United States, because the U.S., by its very importance and by the number of people who write, does determine to a large extent what the rest of the world thinks. But certainly it was very, very prevalent in the U.S. among academic economists. First, that actually they would not really worry about poverty and inequality because market would take care of both. Secondly, that if you do worry or you mention that or you write about that, somehow you're envious. And third, if you're not envious, then you really want to start a class struggle. So it was not a very popular topic at all.
But what role do you think, Swanim, the consideration of inequality has in the economic discussion going on in, for example, the US right now? We've just had a couple of budgets published both by the Democrats and the Republicans. Income inequality doesn't seem to be an issue that, whoever's the brain trust in the Democrat and Republican parties, at least the mainstream part, terribly interested in, really.
Well, I think it is changing. I think if you
sorry, Swanim first, and then Branko.
We haven't covered the sort of the American situation in the report here. The focus has really been on the developing countries over the years. But I must emphasize here that there was this idea that you would start to address issues of inequality, put in place social protection systems, welfare systems, once you become rich. Now, the big lesson that the developing countries have shown, Brazil, China, India, Turkey, is that you need not be rich, you need not be very affluent and have very high levels of per capita income to start taking care of the poor and the destitute and sort of the underclass. Because in the end, if the people at the bottom don't benefit from the growth process, your aggregate, stupendous performance in economic GDP growth rates and others, a lot of this progress is not sustainable. So you look at India, there's this, in the turn of the century, you have stories about India shining and all that, but they lost the elections. The government that was coming up with that slogan lost the elections. And the government that came in its place sort of learned a lesson and put in place systems like the employment guarantee schemes, for example, and sort of to address inequalities and to make sure that the bottom decile of the population is also part of the success, part of the growth process. You see that in Brazil that we've already discussed about. So I think there's some lesson from what the emerging economies, the big ones, are doing at fairly low levels of per capita income, that actually the developed countries should look at that and not undo what the developing countries are actually beginning to learn.
We appear to have just lost Silvia Allegretto on our satellite. Our apologies for that. But Branko, let's just continue that then. Isn't part of the blame, though, precisely the sort of Washington consensus policies embodied in your own institution, the World Bank? There always seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the great work of researchers like yourself and actually the policy proposals that we end up seeing foisted on a lot of governments, which many of these countries specifically mentioned in the report shook off and rebelled against, frankly.
Well, this is true, actually, that, again, if you look back 10 years ago, the countries in Latin America clearly bucked they went against the trend. So it is, as I said, fairly interesting that we are now learning from them. And it is true, actually, they have done something that very few people expected they would do. Now, the Washington consensus policies, I think, in many aspects have been, I'm not defending them, actually, I was very much critical of them. But in certain aspects, they've been quite successful in the sense they have, things like, exchange rate, budget deficits, real interest rate deregulation, and so on. They have been successful. But they have been pursued in other areas, I think, wrongly and single-mindedly, and led to really sort of reduction in social transfers and social spending and investments in education and health and so on, which essentially then translated in lowering potential rate of growth. So in that sense, these policies have not really paid off. They've been wrong.
Branko Milanovic, thank you very much. Swanim Wagle, thank you as well. Our thanks also to Silvia Allegretti. But that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.